Hello, so the next nutrient that we will talk about is magnesium. This is actually the first mineral that we will be going over. It is also involved in pathways and processes of energy metabolism. Magnesium serves its role by acting as a cofactor in over 300 reactions in the body. It is involved in energy metabolism by serving as a cofactor to key enzymes, including PFK, glucokinase, hexokinase, pyruvate dehydrogenase, transketolase, enzymes catalyzing beta oxidation, and protein synthesis. Sodium potassium ATPase is also magnesium dependent. In the slide presentation, you will see that magnesium acts as a cofactor specifically for ATP-dependent processes, forming a magnesium ATP complex. Interestingly, magnesium deficiency has been linked to conditions such as the metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance, suggesting a relationship between magnesium and glucose metabolism. The remaining slide presentation will review key characteristics and important functions of magnesium in more detail. We see here the food sources of magnesium. So we see it is contained in nuts and legumes and whole grains primarily. We also do see that it's found in coffee, tea, cocoa, and hard water, possibly also in tap water. Here are the forms that are contained in different dietary supplements. And also you can see that food processing may reduce magnesium content. Here we'll see the process of absorption. There are two mechanisms of absorption. First, we have a saturable mechanism, that is carrier-mediated active transport through what is called the TRPM6 channel. And this looks similar to the TRPV6 channel used in the absorption of calcium. Interestingly, we're also going to see some other similarities between the absorption of magnesium and calcium, because the second mode of absorption of magnesium is a paracellular diffusion. And so that was the diffusion of nutrient between enterocytes, and we also saw this process with the absorption of calcium. So we saw with calcium, the primary mode of absorption was a saturable carrier-mediated active transporter, and the secondary was paracellular diffusion. But it's important to keep in mind the specific channel involved in the absorption of magnesium here. It's the TRPM6 channel. We can see here the method of absorption, and we also see the factors affecting the bioavailability of magnesium. So we can see that the free magnesium can bind to any one of the inhibitors, specifically phytic acid or fibers or fatty acids, and when bound to these inhibitors, it will be excreted in feces, limiting its bioavailability and thus ability to be absorbed. But the free magnesium that will be available for absorption, so not bound to the inhibitors, will be transported through the TRPM6 channel through the brush border membrane and into the enterocytes. So we have entry into the TRPM6 channels here. We also have that secondary mode of absorption where we can see that paracellular diffusion into circulation. From here we see the entry of the magnesium into the enterocyte, and then the movement of magnesium from within the enterocyte into circulation. And you can see that there's this ATPase that is used to pump the magnesium from the enterocyte into circulation through the basolateral membrane. And we can see that this is an active process. We see the involvement of ATP as well. We can see that the magnesium that is transported through circulation will either be transported as free magnesium, protein bound, so bound to a carrier such as albumin or globulins, and then also we can see that it can also be complex to these other non-protein structures. So we can see factors affecting the absorption of magnesium. So we saw some main inhibitors previously being phytates and fiber, also excessive fatty acids, but primarily we'll focus on the phytates and fiber. Interestingly, with magnesium, vitamin D will enhance the absorption of magnesium. So this is another similarity that we saw with calcium. So calcium, we know the absorption is increased with vitamin D. The absorption of magnesium is also increased with vitamin D. We'll now see here factors related to the transport of magnesium through the blood. So most is actually going to be transported as free magnesium, with some bound to proteins such as albumin and some complexed with ions. We see the homeostasis of magnesium is regulated by the percent of absorption, also the renal excretion, and the transmembrane flux. So this is going to be similar to a lot of other nutrients, that the homeostatic levels or the homeostasis of the body status of certain nutrients will be regulated by the amount that's absorbed versus the amount that is excreted. We'll see the functions and mechanisms of magnesium, so we can see that about 50% of body magnesium is stored in bone. So a very significant portion of magnesium will be stored in bone, and this is going to also be similar to calcium, also phosphorus. We see a lot of phosphorus stored in bone. Also, the magnesium will play a very significant role as a cofactor for a number of key enzymes involved in hydrolyzing ATP and ADP. So we see that for processes where the enzymes will catalyze a reaction that involve an investment of ATP, where that ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP, or it involves the hydrolysis of ADP, for example, we see that these processes will also be magnesium dependent, and we will see a formation of a magnesium ATP complex. Also, we can see that the sodium-potassium ATPase, the sodium-potassium pumps that we've talked about that create the sodium gradient, involved in a number of processes such as nerve conduction and muscle contraction. So the sodium-potassium ATPases are also magnesium dependent. We see the formation of the ATP magnesium complex here. So we see the phosphate groups, and then we see it complex with magnesium in different ways. So we see magnesium being bound to the 3 phosphates here, or 2 phosphates. So we can see the formation of this magnesium ATP complex. So we see here additional functions and mechanisms of magnesium. You can see that it is involved as a component of phospholipids, also associated with nucleic acid, and it will be involved in over 300 enzyme reactions as part of this ATP magnesium complex. So for reactions that are catalyzed by glucokinase, hexokinase, and PFK, we see the formation of this ATP magnesium complex. Also in oxidative decarboxylation, in the pentose phosphate pathway, and the enzyme transketolase. We see here other enzyme reactions. We see processes involved in beta oxidation, protein synthesis, cyclic AMP formation, ion channel regulation, insulin action. So this is just a few of the processes where we see reactions that involve this formation of the ATP magnesium complex. So we're going to see here some interesting interactions of magnesium with different hormones and nutrients. So we're going to see another similarity with calcium. So we can see that parathyroid hormone increases the absorption of magnesium from the gastrointestinal tract, lowers renal magnesium excretion, and increases magnesium resorption from bone. So this is going to be similar to what we saw with calcium, how when serum calcium is low, the parathyroid hormone and calcitriol increases calcium absorption, lowers renal excretion, and increases resorption from bone. So we can see a similar effect with magnesium. Interestingly, we have calcium competes with magnesium for reabsorption in the kidney. And so magnesium and calcium compete for that reabsorption. We can see that phosphorus absorption is inhibited by magnesium, so there's another nutrient interaction. And then we can see that extra and intracellular potassium balance is also influenced by magnesium. So magnesium affects potassium balance as well. So we have here the RDA for magnesium. In men, it's 400 milligrams per day. In women, it's 310 milligrams per day. Interestingly, it's a little bit higher for those individuals over 31. So those over 31, it's 420 milligrams per day for men and 320 milligrams per day for women. So we can see here the RDA for magnesium for adults. We see in men and women ages 19 to 30 years of age, men will require 400 milligrams per day on average, women 310 milligrams per day. Interestingly, we see that's a little bit higher in men and women who are age 31 and older. So in those 31 and older, men will need 420 milligrams per day, women would need 320 milligrams per day. So we see here deficiency symptoms of low magnesium status, so it's usually associated with some form of disease. Those disease states or conditions affecting the absorption of nutrients, so increasing malabsorption would be associated with low magnesium status. We can see that deficiency of magnesium leads to anorexia, so poor hunger, muscle weakness, and tremors. Also, we see that among those individuals with diabetes mellitus, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and renal disease have generally lower intakes of magnesium. Looking at toxicity, so it is more likely to develop magnesium toxicity among individuals with impaired renal function. We see the tolerable upper intake level being 350 milligrams per day. Interestingly to note, the UL for magnesium only applies to synthetic forms of magnesium obtained from supplements or drugs and does not refer to magnesium intake from food sources. We see that excessive intake of magnesium salts specifically may lead to potentially diarrhea and dehydration.